Hello and welcome back to another Warcraft lore video. This time it's going to be part 1 of my probably 2-part series on Lor'themar Theron. And it's funny, this guy is initially someone who I thought, yeah, he's just a Blood Elf dude, he doesn't have that much lore. Well damn, I was wrong when I started researching this. Things ended up being much longer, so I've decided to do 2 videos about it. This just allows me to go into the proper depth and that sort of thing. So this guy is the current Lord of Kael'thas, and since there is no king, this essentially does make him the leader of the Blood Elves. Now his history actually does go back a very long time, and he has far more story than his in-game representation suggests. So let's jump back in time to the Second War, and in this time he was the commander, or at least the second in command, of the Rangers, with Sylvanas Windrunner being the first in command. And from this position he helped lead the defense against the First Horde, just basically protecting his homeland and ensuring that Silvermoon would not fall to the First Horde. Later on, only one contingent of Blood Elves would fight with the Alliance, but while it was only one, they were certainly quite useful. After successfully defending the borders, he accompanied Terulion and the other leaders of the Alliance to Lordaeron City, and from there they orchestrated a defense against the Horde, and due to a series of events in the Horde side, which culminated with half of their armour being lost to Gul'dan's treachery, the Alliance forces were able to claim a victory. Eventually, they would push the Orcs all the way back through the Dark Portal, and really after this, the Elves actually just dropped out of the Alliance. Basically, they kept themselves to themselves, and they said that there was some very poor leadership and that kind of thing on the part of the humans, though really, the humans were quite successful, and it just seems more like they wanted to get out of this alliance and be left to their own devices up north. So, with the threat of the Horde completely gone, Lor'themar just went back up to Kael'thas, and this is really where he would just remain until the Third War. He became the leader of the Farstriders, and they are an elite group of rangers who are tasked with defending the Sunwell. The Farstriders were initially founded about 500 years ago during the Troll Wars. They were initially just a bunch of warriors who decided to band together and kind of like formally pledge themselves to the defense of the kingdom. But really, they would essentially just form the elite part of the army, and they would be very important in many of the different battles that the Blood Elves would, at the time, High Elves. Of course, they only became Blood Elves after some events that I'm going to cover in this video. And while we're talking about the Farstriders, it's probably worth mentioning that during the Second War, while there was the main fight with the Horde, a lot of the Farstriders were also busy fighting some smaller skirmishes with the Amani trolls. Anyway, so, it's also worth saying that there is a little bit of confusion with the Farstriders. Now, both the novels and the manga contribute to this. I've heard that Lor'themar led the Farstriders into the Third War, with Sylvanas having overall control as the Ranger General, and this does seem like the most reasonable way to do things. But I've also read that the leader of the Farstriders is also the person who gets the title of Ranger General, which would mean that Lor'themar would have been leading the Farstriders in Warcraft 3, not Sylvanas. So overall, I'm going to go with the former. And actually, hell, I've even read that the Farstriders only came into existence after the Third War, being formed out of the remaining Rangers. Really, it's very messy, and it's probably best just to pay attention to the overall story and not some of the specific ranks with people. It's just unfortunate, but sometimes when there's multiple authors in one story, little things like this happen. Anyway, so for the Third War, well, Lor'themar's role actually comes in rather late. After Arthas had returned from Northrend and sacked the kingdom of Lordaeron, he eventually turned north to Kael'thas. Now, he was under the orders of Tichondrius to secure the Sunwell so that Kael'thas could be resurrected. Now, why did they want to do this? Well, the overall plan was to summon Archimonde into the world, and to do this they needed Kael'thas to use his magic to summon him. Now, Kael'thas had previously been killed in Arthas in his previous life as a paladin, so they needed to resurrect the guy, and to do that, they needed the power of the Sunwell. So, Arthas basically needed to get to the Sunwell, and the only way to get there was through the High Elves. Lor'themar now had a friend called Dar'Khan D'Thyr, and this guy was a magister, and a very ambitious magister. Arthas saw this, and he offered him lots of power, the usual sort of thing basically, in return for a route past the section of the High Elf defences. He agreed, and using his friendship with Lor'themar, he found out some more about the defences, specifically where a specific key was needed, and this key would eventually allow them to open a number of gates, which would let them have far easier passage through the Blood Elf defences. Now overall, this definitely did make the defense far harder for the Elves, and it was this time that Lor'themar was in the Farstriders and was essentially second in command to Sylvanas, whether that be because he was the second in command of the Farstriders or because she had overall command as she was the Ranger General. It's hard to know exactly. But basically, there was a lot of fighting that went on, and Lor'themar presumably aided in the defense of the kingdom. After Sylvanas was killed and their defense was broken, the Scourge ravaged the city, killing the leading convocation of Silvermoon and then King Ansternian himself. It was at this time that Kael'thas was actually in Dalaran, and this left Lor'themar as the highest ranking official remaining. He took leadership of the basically very, very small amount of remaining forces, and he managed to remain in Kael'thas with a small contingent where he led a bit of a resistance. Eventually, Kael'thas would return. Now, it's important to say with Arthas that after he went to the Sunwell, he did leave some forces behind, but he really just moved on back to Dalaran so he could get to the business of summoning in Archimonde. This meant that, I suppose, Lor'themar did have a fighting chance, and that is how he was able to survive. Now, eventually, Kael'thas did return, and Kael'thas was the prince. He renamed their people the Blood Elves, and this was in memory of those who had died, and he chose Lor'themar to be the Regent Lord. It was at this time that Kael then left to help the Alliance resistance fight against the Scourge. And while Kael was busy fighting, Lor'themar started the process of re-establishing their civilization and then fighting just the remaining Scourge forces who were scattered throughout the land. The Farstriders then chose a guy called Halduron Brightwing as their commander. This essentially left Lor'themar in the main command of the defense, and then Halduron being the second in command, because the Farstriders were of course such an elite force. Now, of course, Lor'themar probably could have taken up that job, but Kael did come and make him the Regent Lord, so he had to move on to larger things, I suppose. After this, Lor'themar decided to promote Halduron. He made him the Ranger Commander of Silvermoon, which essentially just meant that he was in full command of the armed forces of their people. Still though, while all these positive things had happened, the land was still full of Scourge, and things were not looking fantastic. Lor'themar had quite a hard time coming to terms with the whole thing, and especially how Dar'Khan was able to find out some information from Lor'themar, which led to, I suppose, just aiding in the fall of Kael'thas. Lor'themar then told Halduron about this story and about Dar'Khan, and essentially his role in the fall of their kingdom. Now, Dar'Khan was actually alive. What happened to him essentially is that they reached the Sunwell, and he did try to claim some of its forces for himself, but of course, that didn't really happen. It was destroyed by the Lich King. Now, there was one thing that was still there from the Sunwell. A girl called Avina Taig was the avatar of the Sunwell. This is just essentially a mortal avatar, and really her story and the full story surrounding that is for another time, but let's just say she was a physical embodiment of the Sunwell, and therefore had a great deal of power. The kind of power that Dar'Khan wanted for himself. So to prevent this from happening, and just the bad things that it would entail, Lor'themar and Halduron decided that they would have to take the guy out. So what they did was they launched an ambush, and while the ambush itself was quite good, Dar'Khan was a little bit more ready. He summoned skeletons, and that forced the Farstrider forces to retreat. They then met Kael'thas, oddly enough, and while they were initially very confused by this whole thing, in fact, they didn't even believe that Kael'thas was a dragon, because at the time he didn't have the ability to switch forms. But then, of course, one of Kael'thas' companions switched into a dragon, and they were at awe. Lor'themar immediately fell to one knee and was sorry for the disrespect. Of course, dragons, especially blue dragons, are highly respected, and, well, you don't want to disrespect a dragon, as I'm sure you can probably imagine. So anyway, they then decided that they would team up with Kael'thas, and this culminated in the death of Dar'Khan at the hands of Avina. Basically, Dar'Khan did kind of elude them from time to time, and eventually he confronted Avina, but she unleashed the full power of the Sunwell, presumably killing Dar'Khan. Anyway, afterwards, Lor'themar put Avina under direct protection of the Blood Elves, and they kept her identity a secret, because she was the avatar of the Sunwell, and therefore just a very important figure to their people, and they just wanted to keep all of that under wraps. Really, it's a little bit of a messy story, and it it's kind of one of those things that slots in on top of, like, already written lore, so I will do a full video on this character at some point. It's just that if we rolled this into the Lor'themar video, this thing would be 40 minutes long, and it would just be ridiculous. And, you know, we need to keep things kind of palatable. Anyway, so, let's move on. While Lor'themar was doing all these different events, I'm trying to clear out the forces, re-establish their kingdom, some of the things between Kael and Garithos had taken place. Now, if you're not filled in, Kael was fighting with the Alliance Resistance, and there was this guy called Garithos who was a complete racist against the Blood Elves. Kael ended up being forced to team up with some Naga from the sea, and this was essentially so that he could complete his mission and not have all of his people die. Garithos, of course, saw this and decided that no, they all had to be executed for treason. Kael and his men, well, elves I guess, were locked up in the dungeons of Dalaran and essentially just had to wait there until they were executed. Of course though, that was not what happened. Lady Vash ended up sneaking through and she essentially let him free. Then a series of events happened and they basically led to Kael'thas leaving for Outland and setting up a kind of like a second part of the Blood Elf kingdom or empire over there. Initially, he was in the service of Illidan, where he did things such as help him fight Arthas in Northrend, which was ultimately a failure, but then they went back, they established bases in Outland, and now there is a bit of a problem. Essentially, they were split up, that is, the two different elements of the Blood Elves. You had Lor'themar and his group, which basically comprised of the vast majority, about 85%, were still in Azeroth, and then Kael'thas and his group were stuck in Outland. Now, Kael'thas himself had promised a kind of, well, basically a promised land to the rest of his people. And he gave Lor'themar direct orders that he was to defend and protect Kael'thas and prepare those who were left behind for the move to Outland. Kael then sent back some forces led by a magister called Romath, and they taught them one of these new methods, and this was how to harvest mana from living beings. Since the destruction of the Sunwell, they had all been suffering from a potent withdrawal symptom, where they just kind of got all weak and decrepit, and overall, if you just actually go to the Isle of Kael'thas and you kind of see those husks, essentially stuff like that. Now, in order to prevent this, they had to suck the mana out of living beings, and I guess there is a bit of an ethical dilemma there. This would later come to the boil. But anyway, the destruction of the Sunwell had led to a lot of the local wildlife just being completely bathed in mana, and therefore they were a fantastic source. Now, a group did refuse this on account of the ethical problem, and Lor'themar was forced to exile them, and he basically said that he could not lead a divided nation. This group kept their original name, the High Elves. And between this time and the Burning Crusade, Kael also sent back a captured Naru called Muur. Now that they had their source of mana and reinforcements from Outland, they were able to quite easily kill off the remaining scourge, and then Romath and the other magisters were able to restore much of the city. And that's where we're going to leave it for part 1. In part 2, we're going to essentially cover what happens to Lor'themar from the Burning Crusade onwards. I will admit that things are perhaps a little bit messy in terms of story, but essentially the TLDR version is that after the Third War, they stabilized the kingdom. The vast majority are still in Azeroth, and those who are on Azeroth want to move to Outland to visit Kael. Of course, the guys in Azeroth are not really aware of just kind of how evil Kael is turning, and I suppose for some people who didn't play the Burning Crusade, it's worth saying that Kael was initially in the service of Illidan in Netherstorm, but then we defeated him there, then he ended up allying himself with Kil'jaeden, and that is what led to the events of the Sunwell. Of the Sunwell patch even. So right now, they essentially just see him as a good guy out there in Outland trying to forge a new destiny for their people. However, as we're going to find out in part 2, things didn't really turn out as planned. Thank you very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next part.